And we're going. All right, good. So our speaker today, Father Tom Dailey of the Oblates of St. Francis de Sales. He directs the Catholic Preaching Institute at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary. He's a gifted homilist, writer, lecturer, podcaster, web director, etc., etc. Okay. Um, Matters of Salesian spirituality, social communications, Catholic education, and biblical theology. Uh, Father Dailey was ordained to the priesthood in 1987, and he earned his doctoral degree in sacred theology in 1993. For our meeting, Father Tom Dailey will share the results of a major research project on the state of Catholic preaching in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. Thank you, Father Dailey.
You're welcome. Thank you, Lou.
I've
Uh,
allowed you to share screen whenever you want to try, and we'll work that out.
Father Dailey, we're super impressed, like all our speakers. And if we went down your bio, we'd be here till 3:30 in the afternoon.
I'm certainly glad you did not do that.
Very, very impressive.
Well, thank you. When Pat invited me, she asked me to speak with you about preaching. So I want to thank Pat for bringing me on to speak about something that everybody complains about. Right?
So fun.
Hymns and homilies. If I heard Archbishop Chaput once, and I heard him 1,000 times say, every time he goes out to a parish, the two things people complain about are hymns and homilies. And in a sense, it's understandable if you think about it, because they're the only two things that are variable each week. I mean, nobody complains about saying the creed or receiving communion or, the other parts of the Mass. But the hymns and the homilies are the things that vary each week. And as we know, and I'll just speak about the homilies, not the hymns, it certainly has an effect on attendance and participation in the Mass. In fact, from my work with the Catholic Leadership Institute and their numerous and widespread surveys throughout North America, the quality of the preaching was always found to be one of the top five, what they call drivers of whether or not people would recommend their parish to someone else. So it's not just a mythology that people complain about, hymns and homilies, but it's certainly something that is on people's minds. So I put together this very brief little PowerPoint so that you don't have to stare at my talking head the whole time, and give you some of the information that Pat asked me to share. This, by way of background, this emphasis on homiletics and preaching was something that was a concerted effort here at St. Charles Seminary. In 2017, the seminary established what is called the John Cardinal Foley Chair of Homiletics and Social Communications, the faculty position named in honor of Cardinal Foley. And I presume all of you knew who he was, though I find that every time I mention his name to various audiences, I usually have to explain who he was, because there are a lot of folks now who don't know Cardinal Foley. But of course, he was the longtime editor of the Catholic Standard and Times here in Philly, before Pope John Paul II named him the head of the Pontifical Council for Social Communications at the Vatican. Cardinal Foley spent his life in the work of communications. And of course, in terms of church communications, homiletics is a key, if not the most prevalent form of communications. So since 2017, we've tried, put our best foot forward to teach the seminarians in a very determined way about preaching, and not in any way patting our own backs. But I've heard from a number of pastors who have said that the guys recently ordained and coming out of St. Charles are very good homilists. In fact, people in the parishes have said that to me. But then they add another statement, or really a question, when they ask me, could you do something about Father so-and-so? fill in the blank who Father so-and-so is. And of course, having already been ordained, Father so-and-so does not study at the seminary. But that has always been in the back of my mind, and we had the opportunity to at least try to address that question when St. Charles Seminary received a $1.2 million grant from the Lilly Endowment. It's the largest ever grant the seminary has received for programming, and it is funding a 5-year project to, it's part of what Lilly calls their Compelling Preaching Initiative. And it's a 5-year project to try to strengthen the preaching in the Archdiocese. We're focusing entirely on the Archdiocesan clergy here in Philadelphia. Now, as I was told when I was preparing this grant proposal, and as I knew from experience, probably the biggest challenge to doing any of this is historical and really cultural, because as Catholics, preaching has never been a huge concern of ours. In fact, in many ways, maybe not so much nowadays, but historically, preaching was what the Protestants did, and Catholics had the sacraments. I mean, I realize I'm oversimplifying it, but it's never been something that we as a Catholic Church have focused on. Unless, of course, there's something that is really important to us. Unfortunately, this did not work this year with the Eagles, but we'll be okay. But what I think I found a quote from, I believe it was Father Richard John Newhouse, who was a convert from Lutheranism, and he was once asked to explain the difference in the celebration of the liturgy between Lutherans and Protestants, and he focused on preaching, and he said, obviously in the Protestant tradition, preaching is a huge matter. It's what draws people into the Protestant services. But for Catholics, he said, Catholics tend to endure preaching to get what they really came for, which is the Eucharist. That's not a conscious thought necessarily, but I think it is part of our history and part of our culture. So we were facing this challenge, among others, in setting up this Catholic Preaching Institute to try to help make Catholic preaching more compelling. And one of the first things we knew we had to do was to ascertain the reasons why people complain so much about homilies, and to do it in a sort of objective way. And so our first project, which was in January and February of 2024, was a research study throughout the Archdiocese, in which we asked people, I think there were a dozen or 15 statements that we offered, and asked them to rate how true it was or not in their experience in their parishes. Now, obviously, the survey was kind of general. It wasn't targeting any one particular preacher. But from these characteristics that we developed of compelling preaching, people responded as to whether or not they had experienced that in their attending Mass in Catholic parishes throughout the Archdiocese. We received close to 6,000 responses from 204 parishes, which was a pretty widespread response we were quite happy with. Interestingly, those who took the survey, it only took about 5 minutes or so, most of them, 93% of them in fact, stated that they attend Mass weekly or more often. So we thought this is a pretty powerful response in terms of the information that we're getting, right? In other words, it's not people who are just complaining or just showing up once in a while, but the regulars gave us a very good picture of what people experience of preaching in the Archdiocese across all of the parishes. I won't go through the whole detailed response. There's actually, you can find it online. I have the website there. There's a 12-page report with all the details for you. But two of the things that we did notice, two gaps that we found between the pulpit and the pew, is people said that the Catholic preaching in the Archdiocese was very understandable. Preachers used clear language, but it wasn't particularly meaningful. They also said that the priests and deacons who were preaching did so with passion and conviction, but not with a whole lot of purpose in the sense of trying to drive people to a closer relationship with Jesus. Still, overall, and I want to make sure that everyone hears this, the results were not as bad as one would think, given all the complaining. In fact, the responses, again, generally speaking, were sort of midway between average and above average, which isn't bad. Although, as I said to the clergy at their convocation, how many of us really think we should just be average? We want to get better at this. And the one correlation that we took from the survey is that those who replied that the homilies that they heard were terrific also said that they were relevant to people's lives, right? There was a direct connection. And in fact, all the pastors in the Archdiocese also made that connection that good preaching, compelling preaching, has to be relevant to people's lives. It's not just in other words, it's not just an academic exercise. Unfortunately, we only had about 20% or so of the 6,000 responses that said that preaching was terrific. So we had some work to do. And one of the things that we did, which we just completed this past year, we did it for the entirety of 2025, was to create a mentoring program. As far as we know, as far as any of the priests in the diocese that I talked to know, it's the first time that something like this has ever been tried in the Archdiocese. What we did is we convinced 10 priests to volunteer to go through this program as fellows in we called it the Disciples of the Word program. And it was a sort of fellowship for these 10 priests who wanted to get better at preaching. We also convinced 10 clergy in the Archdiocese who were kind of identified in the research study as very good preachers. We convinced 10 of them to be mentors to these fellows. So we have 10 priests as fellows, 10 priests as mentors, and then we send out invitation mostly to teachers in Catholic high schools, to lay people to ask them if they would want to be part of it. I was personally surprised at how quickly the school teachers jumped on the invitation. I mean, they were very interested in helping out. So we recruited, if I remember right, 32. We had more who were interested, but who couldn't do it. But 32 lay people. And so we formed 10 cohorts of 4 or 5 or 6 people, 2 priests and at least 3 lay people in each group. And they met once a month throughout 2025 to review videos of in this case, the priest who is preaching, and offer their feedback. The exercise in doing that came up with all kinds of, I think, positive results from what we've seen, both for the priest who is trying to become a better preacher, but also, and quite surprisingly, for the people involved in coaching those priests. So here is just we're still putting together the report from all of this, which should come out next month. But one thing I asked of all of the lay people, especially, was to try to identify what they think is good preaching or compelling preaching. And we took all of their responses and we sort of collated it into this little tiny table here. Basically, five things that they were looking for. That the message had to be clear, that it had to have a point, and preferably just one point. As I often say to my students here, the people in the pews don't know what you're going to say. So if you try to say 12 things, they're not going to be able to figure out what you're saying. So to have a point and have it in a structured or followable way. People also said that preaching is compelling when it's centered on the gospel, when it's centered really on all of the scriptures, but especially the gospel, and not talking about other things. They said the conviction of the preacher matters. In a sense, as we say here in class, the preacher needs to own the message himself first and have a desire to share it. Also, fourthly, that there has to be, and this is the one that was, I think, the biggest one, there has to be a connection between the Word of God and people's everyday lives. It has to be a relatable message, and preferably with an engaging delivery. But of course, that's going to vary from speaker to speaker. And of course, everyone said keep it short. And we all know that people's attention span nowadays is not what it used to be. And again, the people sitting in the pews don't know what this message is going to be about, and so it's hard to stay focused, understandably. And also, keeping it short helps it to be rememberable. So they were the five things that everybody said that will help to make preaching better. Now, to us, none of this was really a surprise. In fact, if you ask my students, it's pretty much what they hear constantly from all the faculty who teach homiletics here. What was surprising, as I hinted at already, was the response of the lay people in these cohorts, who said things like, what an honor it was to do this. This was a way that I could help the archdiocese. They were struck really by being asked to help priests become better preachers. Now that's humbling for us as priests to want help and to get feedback from the lay advisors. But I think it also is an example of both clergy and laity in the church working together to improve everybody's experience. So I had asked them. Well, I should also say that, the participation of the lay people and the comments that we've gotten from them, confirm the fact that preaching is important. That in fact people do listen to what we say, and are seeking something in what we say. So the idea that preaching and the homily sort of doesn't matter to Catholics is not really true. It does matter very much. So anyway, I asked all of them as part of a survey if they had a chance to speak to the people in their parish, the other lay people in their parish, what would they say about listening to homilies? Because one of the things that arose in both the research study and in this mentoring program that we ran is really a confirmation of a very basic principle in communications. And that is that the message that is communicated is not what is said, but what is heard. Think about that again, right? If we're trying to communicate, communication doesn't happen by saying something, but by hearing it. And so the people in the pews have a critically important role to play in whether or not preaching is compelling. And so I asked the lay advisors, what would they say to other people in the parish about listening better or hearing the message better? And these are the things that they came up with. Again, these were said in multiple ways by many people in the program. One is it helps to be prepared, to maybe read the readings ahead of time, try to minimize the distractions around you. We actually responded to this at the Catholic Preaching Institute by creating an online commentary series on the readings each week. just two little 300-word essays that either a priest or a biblical scholar writes one from the view of the pulpit, and a parishioner, various parishioners throughout the archdiocese, will write one from the view of the pew. So, what's their take on the readings each week? And we offer that to anybody and everybody throughout the archdiocese. So a little bit of preparation certainly helps. It gives people a sense of, what may be coming, or at least provide some context, right? A second thing that they would say to people in the pews is try to pay attention. I love that phrase, paying attention, right? You got to pay. There's a cost to it. There's an effort to it. It doesn't just happen automatically. But the reason people said we should pay attention to preachers is because they're talking about God's word. Right? It's not just Father so-and-so giving a speech, hopefully. It's meant to be an exploration of what God is saying to us. And it also is a bit of human courtesy. It's as the bishop and any priest would know, we can pretty much see the whole church from where we're standing. So we can see what people are doing. I know I have one lady in the parish that I go to, front left corner. I can still see her. Every time I start preaching, she picks up the bulletin and starts reading it without fail. So one day I surprised her and I pulled out the bulletin from the pulpit and I said, all right, let's talk about what's in the bulletin. It did connect with the word, but the person speaking can see what you as the listener are doing. So, even if you're not listening, fake it, and it helps us because it looks like you're listening. But the two big things that the lay advisors suggested was listening so that you can learn, which requires some active listening, some intentional listening, or as they say, listen like it matters. Because as part of the liturgy, it does, or it should. And of course, for the preacher, it should matter as well. So, going in with that attitude or that approach, these lay people in the program said would make for a better experience. And one way that you can do that active listening was, as I put it here, learn to listen, right? That, in a sense, anticipate what might be said. Make your own connections to the readings. How does this relate to you and your life? How does this apply to you and your life? And a little trick that someone taught me long ago when listening to speeches and lectures of any kind was try to find one thing in that talk that you will ask a question about. And I tried it, and it really does work. If you're listening, I listen to university lectures all the time. And if you're listening so that you can ask a question, you tend to pay much closer attention. Tend to ask a question, listen to ask a question or listen to have a discussion is another way of saying it. And the last thing, be prepared, even if you don't actually do it, be prepared to share the message that you hear. Would you be able to tell others what the homily was about? Again, part of that is on us as preachers, right? We have to make the message clear and just have one message. But think about how you might tell somebody else that message. Or, and this is important to us, give Father feedback, but feedback that helps. I think Bishop Coffey, I'm sure, can attest to the fact that people who are in church are really very kind and very charitable. Many people will say, Father, that was a nice homily today, or that was a great talk today, as they're leaving church. While we appreciate the charity, that doesn't necessarily help a whole lot because it's not specific. To give you a sense of how kind and charitable people are, I remember the one lady coming up to me after a Sunday Mass and saying, Father, that was such a beautiful homily. Thank you very much. I said, I appreciate your kind words, but you probably want to go tell the deacon that because he was the one who preached today. Again, people are very kind and we do appreciate it, but, providing a little bit more feedback in terms of what you heard, or maybe what you didn't understand, or how this may help you in your life. Any of those kinds of things help us as preachers to make the message more helpful to you. So, as I say, that's just you're getting the first glimpse of the full report that we're going to publish next month about this mentoring program, and kind of gives you a sense, I hope, of what the Catholic Preaching Institute is doing or trying to do, and of sort of where preaching is in the Archdiocese nowadays. We will repeat the program again probably in the fall of this year, or fall and/or spring of next year. And we hope to get another 12 to 15 priests who will go through this, and therefore we'll need another 60 or 80 lay people to help us with this. But our goal at the end of this grant program, which was a 5-year grant, by just this program alone, we will affect, hopefully, it will turn out to be 10% of the priests who work in parishes in the Archdiocese. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you consider the size of the Archdiocese, it is. And if we can help at least 10% of the clergy to become better preachers, then that's going to hopefully have a ripple effect on the Archdiocese, which is where I sort of bring this quote in that I found in research that I was doing. A very famous Protestant preacher named Dwight Moody said the best way to revive a church is to build a fire in the pulpit. Obviously the Archdiocese of Philadelphia is undertaking this tremendous project, instituting hub parishes throughout the Archdiocese. And I think that what we're going to find is the preaching in those parishes, especially in terms of reaching out to people, preaching is going to be the way. In fact, I have a bit of an idea that we can follow up and hopefully get Lily also to fund a different preaching project, which would be preaching not so much in church during Mass, but preaching to those who are not at Mass. But that's down the line for us. At this point, for us to build a fire in the pulpit, of course, we always need priests who are good preachers. And for that, I certainly want to thank you in the Sarah Club and what you do to promote vocations. Because we're not going to be able to have a fire in the pulpit if we don't have preachers in the pulpit. So thank you for all that you do. And thank you for inviting me to share this with you today. And I will stop there and happily answer any questions that I can.
All right. I'll remind everyone, if you have a question, you'll have to unmute yourself. I do not have the authority. I can mute you, but I cannot unmute you individually.
You sound like the Wizard of Oz there, Lou. You got the power, but not 100%. Father, that was fascinating, and it's such a important subject. The homilies, are they preaching, as you refer also, is 10 minute the mark ideal, 10 minutes for a homily in a Mass? Or
honestly, in my experience and in my research, it depends on the homilist and the content of the homily. But generally speaking, we try to tell guys 8 to 10 is about the most people are going to listen to. Great phrase I once heard is that, the mind can only absorb what the rear end can endure. So depending on how hard the pews are in the church, that also factors in. But yeah, 8 to 10 minutes is generally what we shoot for.
Yeah, that's. I remember, and I'll let the others have comments and questions for Cardinal Fall. He was such a sweetheart. When I went back to my homeland, Cuba, with the late, great St. John Paul in 1998, we both bumped into each other at the Hilton Cuba lobby. And I said, "Oh, nice to see you." And I was waiting for my cab. And he said, "No, ride with me." And here he was writing to, he was a narrator of the Mass, the big Mass with the Holy Father. And was Peter Jennings, one of those guys. But always proud of the Catholic Standard Times. In fact, Sue Brinkman did an article on the Cuba Holy Father trip, but he was wonderful. Anybody else have any questions on our homilies and preaching?
I had a quick question, Father Dailey. Good to see you.
Hi, Jay.
Has your work also been with deacons in preparation, or folks, deacons who are already out there preaching?
It's a great question. I certainly wanted to be. Now, this first mentoring program was all priests. One of the reasons we did it that way was simply because the priests in a parish preach more often than a deacon does.
Sure.
So, the sort of greater effect there. In fact, I'm mulling over in my head as we continue with the Catholic Preaching Institute of maybe doing a different kind of mentoring program if there are deacons who are interested. Because the priest program, we met once a month and they would have 5 or 6 homilies that they would review. But if deacons are only preaching, say, once a month, and I hear that tends to be the norm, then we may have to do it differently. But we're certainly not excluding the deacons, not at all. Mm-hmm.
We were always taught less was more too, Father. That was our catchphrase.
Well, and that's let me tell you something. As an oblate of St. Francis de Sales, St. Francis de Sales actually wrote, technically speaking, it was a letter. It was a 68-page letter, but it was a letter to another bishop who asked him for advice on preaching. And one of the things he said in the letter, and remember, he's a doctor of the church, so this is wisdom. He said, "Bishop, if you can't be good, at least be brief." Brilliant advice. Brilliant. Now, of course, in his day, brief meant just an hour. Nevertheless, it's still good advice.
I will share that, I'm a lifelong cathedral parishioner and worn the various hats, but I always do what we now call greeters. We're greeters, collectors, ushers. I realized that very quickly that Archbishop Chaput approached his homily a little differently, in that first of all, the time, and I don't know that I paid so much attention the first time, but with the time I did the second time, I started timing it, and his homilies would run 23 to 29 minutes long.
Wow!
All right, but there's more to it. There's more to it because I kept listening, and I started realizing and seeming surprised at myself. I'm a senior person, and I've been listening to homilies, reading what I could, watching what I could on Catholicity all of my life, and I realized I always learned something from Archbishop Chaput. And I was surprised. I didn't always agree with sometimes, but all right, fine. And I realized, here's what he did. And it came out. He talked about the readings, the lessons of the day, really. But he also then always gave a lesson in just what's happening in the world out there that might relate to spirituality and the church. And then another third of his homily would be talking about Catholicity itself. So he always taught Catholicity, and another third he talked about how it related to the world outside, and he talked about the readings. And I thought that was wonderful, but 23 to 27 minutes was hard on the tuchus.
Mm-hmm. Great for special occasions. Yeah, I'm not sure,
Well, I really respected that, though, that he was able to
very
do it.
Good. Yep.
And my little joke is, sorry to take up all his time, but my little joke is, but it's not a joke. I wasn't paying attention. I'm running around doing things, answering questions as a greeter with people, and I realized he was closing up his reference books that are all nested and his files. He was moving his papers all to the side. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's finished. I looked at my clock and it was only 18 minutes. But then he said, and now let's talk about today's readings. So he was just starting his homily, really.
Good stories. We were close to the Toronto Chautauqua, as most of my fellow members know, on the board, and we enjoy. And they used to be, I guess, in Poland, like in Latin America, the homilies can get a little extended. But in the last few years, their homilies are very profound. I think they meet a lot of the criteria, as you mentioned, Father Dailey, and they limit it to 8 to 10 minutes. And sometimes they leave you wanting more. So that's good.
Good.
Could I piggyback on to Lou? Father, thank you for doing this. This is wonderful.
You're welcome.
Back on to what Lou said, because what struck me was I'm remembering one of our presentations, I'm going to say within the last 18 months, and I just don't recall who the speaker was, but I do remember a comment from either Monsignor Bolger or maybe it was Father Janton, who said, our priests are not teaching anymore when they preach. And we've lost that. And I was so glad to hear you speak about that. And for Lou to comment about Archbishop Chaput. I find that the homilies that I most value are the ones where I am learning. The priest is teaching, and there can be 17 minutes, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. But as long as it's compelling and I'm learning, I'm happy about that. So I think, as you said, it varies from priest to priest. But I love to hear you talk about the fact that you're teaching them to teach again. I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, we do teach them to teach. In fact, I was just having this conversation with my guys last week. But the important thing that I try to emphasize to them is not so much teaching about some topic, but teaching them what the Word of God is trying to say to us, is trying to reveal to us, how it's trying to inspire us. Because ultimately that's what we're trying to teach, what God's Word is saying, which does involve learning, and it does involve learning how that applies to life. But teaching is only one part of the preaching endeavor, because we need for that teaching to take hold in people, to convert them, really is the word. We're all called to a continual conversion. So a learning that affects us, and that's where the kind of preaching to the heart comes in. That's the challenging bit. That's the hard part. Teaching informs the mind, but we're not just minds. We're also affective people, and we're also active people. So, how do you teach the mind and move the heart, and get people to live out their relationship? That's the ultimate goal. Sometimes I think one gets emphasized more than the other, which makes sense. But ideally, we want to touch the whole person.
Yeah. Father, I remember I worked closely with Bishop Dellerman, and for about 16, 17 years with our Hispanic ministry, and did that Mass in Spanish in the cathedral with Univation for 14 years. And it wasn't Father Gus, God rest his soul, it was another priest that spoke Spanish. I was going to Mexico to the Lady Guadalupe Shrine, and he said, go to this Catholic bookstore at the Guadalupe Shrine, Mexico, and find me this homilies book. And I found it, and I read parts of it in the airplane. And basically, it was a guide for the priests about the readings that day, and a homily, kind of a Kickstarter. Is that something that the priests use today, or most priests are encouraged to read that quietly, pray on it, and then inject your points?
Yeah, there are all kinds of processes to prepare for preaching, but that's certainly one of them.
Yeah, yeah, it was very good actually. Fascinating. That is a good area of our church to, I think, reel in more of our beloved Christers to Mass every Christmas and Easter Catholics for those that come. It is those important 10 minutes can be a hook. This has been wonderful. Father, anybody else have any comments for Father Dailey? Because I know Father Dailey's
Wonderful.
his afternoon planned, I'm sure. But this is wonderful. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, and everybody attended. Thank you. Remember the cheese. We'll be putting out notices on the cheesesteak at the seminary on February 9th, the day after the Super Bowl, actually. And those that are with us that are not members, please the door's open. We want you. Go to our website and hit the join button.